I've been really looking forward to this one. I think this is going to be a great session. I quite enjoyed putting it together quite cheekily. I think we have the perfect couple of guests to speak on this topic. And it's a topic that does divide the libertarian movement or confuses the libertarian movement. It's not clear how to respond to the social justice movement, which can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think the next two speakers are very eloquent, perhaps some of the most eloquent explainers of the way they respond to the social justice movement in very different ways, but coming from a position philosophically, politically quite similar. Both great advocates for liberty, both great advocates for freedom, and their credentials there can't be doubted. And yet they look at the social justice movement and see different things and draw different lessons. And we're going to learn from those lessons here. We're going to start with, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but start with Professor Stephen Hicks, who is going to give us his take on how libertarians should respond to the social justice movement. Thank you, Stephen.
I appreciate very much this invitation, and kudos to inviting Steve Horowitz to talk with me about this issue. As you say, he's leading voice for liberty and a thoughtful man and a decent man, and this is, as you say, an issue that we really need to sort out for ourselves. So my approach is to say that when we think about liberty, the free society, and its concomitant elements, markets and so forth, we are starting from a position of society-wide abstraction. We're thinking of individual human beings, each with their own goals, dreams, rights, and so forth. And we're devising principles and policies for all of them, right, as individuals. And so we say people should have certain rights. They should have certain freedoms. We need to have a limited government that is impartial and doesn't put people into subordinate groups and hierarchical groups and so forth. Now, then we come to a particular case of hard cases that arise. There are people who are poor. There are people who are oppressed. In some cases, these are just legitimately hard cases. Sometimes they are people who've fallen into bad luck. In some cases, they are people who have part of groups that have historical grievances. And so what we then have is a genuine subset of issues about how liberty, freedom, and our movement should respond right to those individuals. And I think the right way to approach this is to say that we think that freedom as a universal principle, equally and impartially administered by a set of institutions, is the best way to go. And then that is the case that we first and foremost need to make. Now, I have no problem with then saying we are then also interested in, since different individuals and different groups have different histories and situations, how is it going to work out for them? So, in the case of women, right, who have suffered second-class citizenship or sexism, if we advocate entrepreneurship and limited government for them, there's detailing issues that are going to be going out for that particular group. What about the rural poor as opposed to the urban poor? And so there are going to be sub-cases that we are making, but we always have to realize that we're taking our universal principles and applying them to those particular sub-cases. And the answer is always going to be, and we say, so we take the case of poverty, give people freedom, then they can work their way out of poverty. Encourage entrepreneurship, and they can use their creativity and their resolve to get out of poverty. In many cases, government regulations are the biggest obstacle to stopping people from getting out of poverty, so repeal those regulations. In many cases, yes, there have been unequal rights in various pieces of legislation, and those have had historical consequences. Get rid of those unequal rights. And in the case of the hardest of all hard cases, we then think, well, if we do all of that, we're going to create a very prosperous society. And for the genuinely hard cases, being in a prosperous society, we'll have lots of wealth, and people are basically good. So we're going to have a very robust civil society and lots of philanthropy to deal with those individuals. Now, I think that's the right way to approach moral philosophy and political philosophy, and to make the case for freedom, and to nest our special concerns about particular individuals in circumstances or even groups that are suffering from certain kinds of circumstances. Now, when we turn to a label like social justice, as our introducers pointed out, it does mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but it does come down to really two or at most three standard uses of social justice. And I think one of them is confused and two of them are suspect in varying degrees. So I want to talk through on that. In one case, when we talk about social justice, or we start to think about the poor and the oppressed people, the language that we use is to say that the poor and the oppressed should have a kind of a special place in our hearts. And so what we need to do is, in making the case for liberty, adopt a certain rhetorical stance of showing that we are not just kind of abstractly, rationally having all of these principles and we're just mechanically applying them to the poor as if that's going to solve the problem, that we have a rhetorical problem, that people think of us as too impersonal and abstractive. So if we lead with a more emotional language and say, we really care about the poor or we really care about the oppressed, then we're more likely to get some traction. And at one level, I think that is fine. We do have to have a case for liberty that integrates rational argument with emotional caring, right, and so forth. So our reason and our emotion should be indicated. But if we go in the direction of saying that as a matter of rhetorical strategy, that, or as a matter of principle, that what we should be doing is asking what issues or what individuals most get our emotions worked up and lead with our emotions on that, then I think that's an inappropriate strategy. The emotion has to be backed up and congruent with a principle that is being applied. So if we want to say we are compassionate for people who have been victims of oppression, we have to have a very good case for saying why we think that is an injustice, why those individuals have been treated badly. It can't just be an emotionalist rich kind of lead. So we need to integrate those two, and any sort of movement that wants to prioritize emotional appeals over logical and rational appeals, I think is inappropriate. Now, more seriously, we find in political philosophy and political morality, of course, there's a longstanding tradition that says those who are poor, those who are handicapped, those who are suffering, have a kind of higher moral standing, and that when we are thinking about moral claims, we should care more about people who are poor, to the extent that we make secondary the status and the issues and so on, and we might be willing to change or fudge or adopt our moral principles in the case of dealing with poorer people. So we find, for example, in the case of John Rawls is perhaps the most famous example with his difference principle. He's saying what we should be doing as a matter of moral principles to say whatever we're going to do socially and politically, we have to prioritize the needs of the weak, and whatever policies we design, they have to most help the poor, the weak, the disadvantaged, and so on. And I think that is an inappropriate, that what we can and should be able to say is moral principles apply universally to all people. And there are going to, of course, be special emotions that we have for people in different circumstances, right? People who are poor are going to call forth our compassion. But at the same time, people who have earned $1 billion, they should call forth our admiration. And I think it's inappropriate to say that whatever we're doing socially and politically, we should prioritize the needs and the advantages of the most rich, right, or the most advantaged, or the people in this group. It's the same error in the other way to say that we're going to put our thumbs on the scale for the most poor and the most disadvantaged. As moral philosophers, we come in treating human beings as having the same moral capacities, the same moral rights, the same moral obligations, and so on. And then I think that, of course, carries over when we start doing political philosophy. We don't want to take people in the polity and put them in different groups and suggest that they have any sort of different standing because of their group membership, whether they're in different races, different sex or gender groups, different economic classes, right, and so forth. We have a policy of equal rights across the board. So I think, for example, affirmative action is a good example. It can, of course, be a voluntary program, but it can also be a political program. And affirmative action, the standard arguments for it do come out of this tradition of saying, here we have people who are in a disadvantaged situation. Sometimes it's because of their economic background or a history of sexism or a history of racism. So what we need to do, in effect, is reverse that or tip the scales, and as a matter of policy, give preference to those individuals because of their currently disadvantaged status. And again, I think as a matter of politics, that's a disaster, that what we need to do then is say, we have equal principles of merit and getting what you earn. But yes, we are concerned with people who are struggling as a result of traditional sexism, right, or history, or racism, right, or whatever the problem is, that what we need to do is to say a principle of justice, of freedom, of equal rights, of limited government applied impartially, that works for everybody equally, and so forth. Now, the labels, I think, become very important here. So the labels that are at issue here is, I'm going to say I'm entirely in favor of justice, but I'm entirely unsympathetic to social justice, right? And we always have to ask, what is the point of adding an adjective to a perfectly good concept? And in this case, the adjective is carrying a lot of weight, some of it just confusion, some of it, in fact, baggage that is, in my estimation, philosophically corrupt. So what we mean by justice is people who are in a system, that they know ahead what the rules are, and they have freedom of entry, and they can bring their own talents and so forth. To the extent that they create something valuable, they will be economically rewarded, or they will be psychologically rewarded with praise and so forth. The idea then is you get what you earn, and that it's individuals who are doing the producing of the value. Of course, the flip side of that holds. If you destroy value, or you fail to create value, then as a matter of justice, you deserve some sort of censure or some sort of plan. So the point then is, justice is tightly tied to the concepts of desert, earning, productivity, and trying to measure those things. And we are interested in individuals as the agents who are engaging in this process. Now, when we turn to social justice, the adjective does become important here. And in some cases, it's just a matter of saying, well, as a matter of social justice, we need to be thinking more broadly, and that there are different groups and individuals who fall through the cracks, and we might have some social-wide obligations to try to help those out. And so then we get into debates about welfare policy, right, and so forth. It's not just a matter of individual cases in a court or individual market allocations. It's more broad legal principles. And at that point, I think it's a little bit obscuring, but I think it's fine, as long as we always remember that ultimately whatever policies we're coming up with are designed for individuals. We're not talking about amorphous social groups and so on. Now, where I think things start to get suspect here, and this is built into the history of the movements that have traditionally used social justice, right, as a label, is that when they talk about social justice, they do start to talk about groups. And from their perspective, groups are more important than individuals, and they start to lose sight of individuals. So they don't see you as an individual, they see you as a white person, or as a male, or as a member of some class or other, a rich group, right, or a middle class. So the class analysis becomes very important. And the argument also in the social justice literature always is that these groups have certain rights or entitlements as a matter of principle. And so what we then have is group rights, right, substituting for individual rights. And that's an inappropriate move. That from this perspective, justice is something that's a property of groups, right, rather than individuals. And it comes out more explicitly then when we start to say in response, but these particular individuals in this group, they haven't done anything to earn, right, this extra privilege or this extra grant that you want to give to them. And the fact of their not earning then is not taken as a criticism because they are part of a group. And if we then want to say we're going to redistribute from one group to another group, then we say, well, of the people you're redistributing from, those individuals did not participate in the injustice or whatever. That also doesn't matter. They have an obligation in this case. So what we have in both cases is this use of social justice is about distributing from people who don't deserve to be redistributed from to individuals who've not yet earned the right. So the concept of earning that's built into justice goes away, and it's now collectivized instead of individualized. Now that, I think, is a philosophical gulf that we need to be facing front and square. When we are talking about justice, are we talking about individuals and earning and desert, or are we talking about groups and we are interested in redistributing to make things a more equal fashion and so forth? And you can't have it both ways. So in that case, I wanted to say, no, we need to stick with justice. Social justice is taking us in the wrong direction. Now, I think there also, though, is a way, and this is where some of the literature that I read, it's not just standard social justice, where the concept of social justice is used not just as a replacement for another individual justice, not that we're having debates about whether justice is individual or collective or not, but that social justice is used by this subgroup as an explicit anti-concept. And what I mean by an anti-concept is a concept that is meant to replace and destroy the original concept that one had in mind. So in this move, and what we then have is a concept of justice, but we add social justice, and then eventually we are going to drop out the concept of justice altogether. And that is what we're starting to find in some segments of the social justice movement right now. They want to say it isn't about justice. It's about social, it's about power, it's about asserting our moves. And so it's an evolution. So what we then have is we start talking about justice, then we're talking about social justice a generation later, and then we're just talking about social power and dynamics as well. And the justice has gone away. And this is consciously strategic on the part of some of the thinkers in this movement. So if you take, for example, the concept of privilege that we're now using or having a lot of debate, this is part of the overall package here. Privilege has a perfectly good meaning. It means a social favor that is granted by someone in a position of authority. Your mom or your dad gives you a privilege of staying up an extra hour past your bedtime, right? Or if you belong to a tennis club, they will give you the privilege of bringing in a certain number of guests, right? And so forth. But the concept of privilege then was introduced by some segments, right, of the traditional social justice theory literature. And what it was then meant to do was to say that everything that is an inequality among people, any advantage that anyone has, is a matter of privilege. And so that then is obliterating many legitimate differences that exist between human beings. Sometimes we're unequal because of natural differences, not because of privileges. Sometimes we are unequal because I worked less hard than you did. You worked really hard and worked really smart. I didn't. That's not a privilege, right? Or sometimes it's a matter of gifts that I received from my parents as opposed to gifts that you received from your parents. And so what we then have is, instead of saying, well, there are inequalities and advantages, some of them are natural, some of them are earned, some of them are social, and some of them are privileges that are being granted. Instead, all of it becomes privilege. But then the point is that we are obliterating the idea that there are legitimate natural differences, or that there are earned differences, or that there are legitimate gifts that some people can give to others, and so on. And that is intentional on the part of those who are intentionally overusing the concept of privilege. So I would say that's a subset issue within the broader social justice category. So what I would say is we need to stick to our very powerful guns. We believe in individuals, we believe in justice, we believe in entrepreneurship, we believe in limited governments, we believe in impartially applied principles, and that is how we're going to do our moral and political philosophy, with special detailing and interest for the cases of those who are in special difficult situations and so on. Now, at the same time, and this will be my concluding remark, there's a strategic issue, and I know sometimes when I'm talking with my fellow academics, and as advocates of freedom, liberty, classical liberals, libertarians, objectivists, we are a beleaguered minority, and often we feel that way inside the academy. And particularly those who are doing explicit political philosophy, they will often say the social justice labeling and vocabulary has swept the field, and unless we adopt the vocabulary, we're just not going to be paid attention to. And so from that perspective, it's a tactical adoption of some possibly suspect terminology in order to get a seat at the table so that you can make your arguments. Now, I am fine with making tactical accommodations. I am fine with even making strategic alliances with people we have philosophical and political disagreements with, but I do think that whenever we make these alliances, we always have to recognize that they are partial. They are partial alliances, and we always have to keep our terms and principles very clear. We are intellectuals, we are policymakers, we are professors. Precision of language is our most important tool, and we can't surrender that right at all. So I'll end with a hopefully not too silly analogy. So we are in the middle of World War II, and we are Canadians like I am, or Americans like Steve, or like the Australians, and we have a common enemy. We're fighting the Nazis, and then at a certain point, the Nazis turn on the Soviet Union, their former allies, and they attack them. And then the Soviets come around and say, let's have an alliance because we have a common enemy in the Nazis here. I'm saying that's fine, right? We do have a common enemy, and then maybe it's a worse enemy. We will have an alliance with the Soviet Union in order to fight this fight. But we're not going to adopt the Soviet Union's labeling for what the nature of the fight is. So they say this is the great proletarian war against the capitalist imperialist oppressors. Right? We don't want to go there, even though we are strategic allies. So to come back to the social justice issue, if at any point, social justice involves a collectivization and a subversion of the idea that you really in life deserve to get what you have earned or what value you have created, and it involves redistribution of unearned benefits, then we need to say no. At best, this is a tactical alliance against racists, against sexists, and so forth. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was, I think, a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed that. So we've just heard from Professor Steve, so we're going to now switch to Professor Steve to mix things up a bit, just to make things nice and confusing for you all. Steve Horowitz has been writing about similar issues for a while now. And I got to say, Steve Horowitz, I don't always agree with you, but I always make sure I read you because you're one of the people that we need to make sure that we're listening to as a gut check, as a reality check. And I really appreciate what you do, and I really appreciate you coming on here to talk to us. So, Steve Horowitz, over to you.
Well, thank you, John. And, it's all about the clicks, right? So as long as you read me, that's that's what really matters. And as Steve said, thank you for inviting both of us to do this. I think I can't think of a perfect. It's a really good pairing with the two Steve H's here to have this conversation. And in listening to Steve, I think what I'm going to do is end up emphasizing our points of disagreement, which I think are mostly points of emphasis. Maybe Steve might call them strategy too, given his last few remarks. But I think in substance, we largely agree. And I want to try to emphasize, I had some prepared remarks, which I'm going to stick to, but I want to emphasize the bits of those that I think pull out where I think the differences are between what we're saying. And I think perhaps the best way to start with that, let me start with the quote I was going to start with, which is this Frederick Douglass quote that's been making the rounds that says, I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong. And I think that picks up right where Steve left off, which is as we think about how we, as libertarians, want to relate with the social justice movement, we need to recognize that there are things there that we want to unite with to do right. I think, and I'm going to emphasize those. But certainly, as Steve points out, there are other parts of that movement that we're not obligated to agree with simply because we find that their emphasis on other issues is good. So we don't, to stay with your last analogy, Steve's last analogy, we don't have to buy into the whole Soviet view of World War II to have the strategic alliance to defeat the bad guys. So with that in mind, I think what captures the differences in our approach is best. Steve, a couple times used the phrase how we're going to emphasize this sort of our usual libertarian broad vision of freedom, and we're going to nest, and that was the word he used, nest within that these particular concerns about race and gender and so forth. And I think for me, I want to sort of turn that inside out. And I want to say, rather than nest those within that, I want to foreground those as being particularly important for how we think about what libertarians should be doing and how we should be interacting with the social justice movement. And I think to sort of pick up another point that Steve made, I think I want to be clear that it's not about leading with emotions, although, as Steve pointed out quite rightly, having an emotional appeal as part of a larger rational argument is oftentimes very powerful. I think for me, the concern with issues of race and gender discrimination and poverty and so on is not so much a matter of emotion, but a matter of deciding which rights violations out there are ones that we think are so important and so fundamental and so egregious that we want to highlight and foreground them. And for me, many of the ones that we talk about when we talk about race and gender fit that category. And certainly, I think when we think about things like police brutality and George Floyd and the sort of issues that have been raised around the carceral state, when we talk about freedom and we talk about justice, those are, I think, central issues. And I think libertarians, it behooves us to be at the center of those conversations where we can. I think the other point I would make at the start, and this is the one I really want to focus on sort of in my prepared remarks, is that I think the social and social justice that libertarians can be okay with it is a little bit different. I think I agree with the first, I think it was the first of the three things that Steve mentioned, right? I think that's right, but I think there's more to it. And I think it's the following, that the social justice movement is correct about something. They're correct to identify that many of the problems with racism and sexism are structural and institutional discrimination. They're not just about changing people's hearts. The argument from the social justice folks is that we're not going to make a more just society, a more racially equal society, by just making people nicer. That's not going to solve the problem. The problems are deeper, they're structural, they're institutional. And I think that's a point that libertarians can agree with. I think it's one that we've emphasized. But the difference, of course, is which institutions and which structures we think are responsible. But for me, the key to that institution and structure point is to say that not all of the injustices that we might point to can be neatly tied back to individuals. To say that some person did something wrong, right? And this is, as much of a Hayekian as I am, this is a point where I'm, over the years, I've become more critical or less persuaded by Hayek is probably the way to put it, right? That in fact, and I would make this argument on sort of Hayekian grounds, that oftentimes what we get is a kind of emergent order of structures and institutions that have built into them long-standing bits of discrimination, of racism, of sexism, that aren't part of the behavior of the people who currently staff those institutions and who are part of them, but rather are deep in the institutions and structures themselves. And remedying what the injustices that those cause, it seems to me, is legitimately in some meaningful sense of the term social. It's not just about fixing the mistakes of individuals or changing individuals' hearts, although those are all good things to do. So again, I think libertarians can agree with the social justice movement that these problems are not just a matter of individuals harboring animus, but rather that we have these structures and institutions. And I think the sense in which the phrase social justice gets used, and I think Steve really nicely laid out the multiple uses of this phrase and the way that it's evolved over time, and I quite agree with his point about the third one. When it becomes into this notion of social power, we have a real problem. But I do think if you sort of ask people on the street what they think social justice means, I think the answer would be something like making sure that the least well-off among us, whether that's by race or by gender or by class, are treated fairly and equitably and so forth. That the idea that they are not, right, and that the demand for social justice is a demand that we ensure that they are. Okay, I think when we look at social justice that way, and when libertarians look at social justice that way, I think it means prioritizing the well-being of the least well-off, again, whether it's race, class, gender, whatever it might be, and advocating for the structural changes that could remedy, if not end, the injustices that they face. And I think what's interesting about this for libertarians is we have a great story to tell about this. We have a historical story to tell about how white supremacy and racism and sexism of the past are at the bottom of so many government interventions and so many restrictions on freedom that have created the racial and gender inequities that social justice advocates rightly complain about. There's a story here, again, about structural and institutional oppression. We can talk, the obvious one we can talk about is slavery and the after effects of slavery. But beyond that, we can talk about labor market interventions in the United States, say during the progressive era, from things like the minimum wage laws to limits on the hours that people can work. We can talk about tax law in the United States that's punished women who've wanted to work outside the home, as well as other paternalistic labor market regulations that have done the same thing. There's a terrific book on the history of U.S. housing policy called The Color of Law. The author's name is Rothstein, that goes through how government policy systematically discriminated against African Americans in housing policy, and is significantly responsible for the difference in home ownership and the kind of housing related wealth blacks and whites have in the United States today. And that contributes significantly to the overall racial gap that we see in wealth. And of course, we can talk about and do and should continue to talk about things like the war on drugs, like the combination of welfare and tax policies that have destroyed families of all kinds, but particularly the black family. And we can also talk, for example, about how horrific public schools have robbed generations of poor and particularly persons of color of the human capital they need to succeed in all the ways that Steve was talking about. I once argued a number of years ago that no Ku Klux Klan meeting has done more harm to black Americans than the poor quality of urban public schools. And it's also why so many, I think, families of color want school choice. And we can add to this other stories about the variety of ways in which sex workers who tend to be female are treated by the law and by the police, as well as the LGBT community and so forth. Sexual minorities are also victims of the state and have been for a long time. And we should see ourselves as foregrounding and fighting for their rights and their equal treatment. And when we add to that the issues that we're facing in the United States more recently with the carceral state and the racist enforcement of the law, George Floyd was the last straw, I think. But it's important to emphasize that libertarians have been out in front of these issues for a long time. And for those who are watching, if you have not read the work of Radley Balco, you should. He is perhaps one of the most important libertarian authors out there writing on these issues today. And these are issues that we should continue to keep foregrounding and talking about, issues of police brutality in the context of race and beyond it. We can talk about the regressive consequences of economic regulation. There's all kinds of ways that we can use the kind of stories that libertarians tell anyway about the problems that the state has caused, and to point out that in fact the state has been, those state interventions have particularly harmed the very groups that social justice movement is concerned about. And I do think it's important for us to add, after that, to ask the question, why is it then that our friends in the social justice movement are so confident that giving the state more power will solve those problems? I think that's one of the questions that we as libertarians can ask of the social justice movement in a way that I think forces them to confront the complexities of their position in a whole bunch of different ways. One last point I would make, too, is about this particular topic, is that our desire and our concern about the least well-off should not stop at national borders. Interestingly, we don't see the social justice movement talking very much about things like free trade and open borders and open immigration. But the work of people like Brian Kaplan has pointed out that if there's one thing we could do to improve the lot of some of the most oppressed people on the planet, it would be enable them to come to the United States and Australia and Canada and the rest of the Western world in ways that would improve their well-being dramatically and improve ours in the process. So if we really believe, if we're concerned with social justice, that's another, we shouldn't let it stop at the borders of the United States. And there's a whole interesting debate in philosophy over how far our obligation for social justice extends. And I think libertarians have something important to say there too. The other set of points I really wanted to make today is I want to point out that all of this stuff I'm talking about is part of our history. It's a quirk, I think, of the 20th century. Quirk might be underselling it, but it's certainly a 20th century phenomenon that we found ourselves aligned with the forces of conservatism as we both went to fight socialism. Again, another example of the point that Steve raised earlier, just because we work with someone in an alliance doesn't mean we agree with everything they have to say. I think, and this might be a controversial claim, but I think we won the victory over socialism in practice in 1989 and 1991. And I think in many ways we've won it in theory, even though the zombie keeps trying to kind of come back to life. But until that point, until that alliance with the right to fight off socialism, classical liberalism was a progressive leftist, in the way we would think about it now, movement, and one in particular that fought for equal rights across race and gender. If you read Adam Smith, one of the things you see right away in Adam Smith is what later authors have called his analytical egalitarianism, the idea that the street porter and the philosopher don't differ from birth, they differ from the kinds of lives they've led and so on, that people are people and that they should be treated equally. John Stuart Mill, despite his flaws from a libertarian perspective, was an ardent opponent of slavery and fought for gender equality and racial equality in ways that when we read now, seem particularly modern. And closer to home in the 20th century, Mises and Hayek were among the few scholars of the early 20th century who managed to avoid the plague of eugenics and other progressive era flirtations with racism and sexism. And as libertarians, we've always insisted on that equality before the law that Steve talked about. And despite the recent book by Nancy MacLean, even in more modern times, Jim Buchanan was someone who was coming right out of that Adam Smith tradition of analytical egalitarianism. And it's worth pointing out that the United States Libertarian Party had a gay rights platform plank and supported same-sex marriage before anybody knew what those issues were about. And I was really glad to hear Steve point out, and I want to emphasize this point, that we as libertarians have always talked about civil society, about the role that charities and religious institutions and so forth play in ensuring that those who need help can get it. When you go to serve meals to shut-ins, working with your local house of worship, or when you donate to Doctors Without Borders, in some meaningful sense, you're doing the work of social justice. And that's part of our tradition too. In all of these ways, right? Thinking in terms of how we help the least well off and recognizing that oftentimes their oppression is not a matter of just changing people's hearts, but changing structures is part of our movement, even if we don't see the world the same way the modern social justice movement sees it. I haven't talked about as well the ways in which capitalism in particular liberated women from the drudgeries of housework and had made marriage into a contract rather than a relationship of domination. And capitalism and markets played a huge role in making gay and lesbian identity possible and making their claim for equal rights. So one of the products of our own beliefs and historically the ideas that we've seen put into practice has been increased legal equality for racial and sexual minorities and increases in their material well-being. Liberal capitalism delivers social justice, and libertarians shouldn't shy away from making that claim. And we shouldn't shy away from talking about how the state, including and especially economic intervention, is a source of racial and gender disparity and injustice. History, I think, and theory are on our side. Let me sort of close my comments with a couple of strategic thoughts, so I think, as Steve did as well. If libertarian ideas are going to capture this generation, we will have to address these questions of race and gender and sexuality. And we'll have to do it, I think, if not using the language that others use, at least being able to talk in ways that resonate with those young folks. Empty slogans about freedom alone won't do it, nor I think we'll be pleading for color blindness. To say that the state should treat everyone equally is not to deny that we should pay attention to race. Black lives matter precisely because they are not treated equally. We have to pay attention to race and gender and sexuality because the injustices they face are real. And I would argue among the most important injustices and the worst injustices that we might talk about today. And we as libertarians can offer a coherent narrative about the source of the problem and ways to solve it. Others might think we're wrong, and it's certainly possible that we are, but they might be wrong as well, and that's fine. Let's have the conversation, and let's try to make it clear to others that we think the issues are real and that they matter. The social justice movement has its flaws from a libertarian perspective, but we do share a number of important concerns. And rather than pushing them away for where we disagree, I think we should be emphasizing our points of agreement in our own self-presentation as libertarians and trying to work with them where we can to forward our mutual concerns. If they reject us, they reject us, and it's their loss. But if we can establish good faith, perhaps we might make the world a freer and more equal and more just place. The issues are too important and the opportunity here is too great to let the weight of our historical concerns about the term social justice stop us from doing the work that needs to be done. We owe at least that much to the long list of victims of state-sponsored violence and oppression and to our citizens of color who live in justified fear of the state every single day. I'm going to add actually one other small point because Steve brought up the word privilege, and I think it's a fascinating word for a bunch of reasons. And I agree with many of the things Steve said, that it gets misused in ways that I think are problematic for libertarians. But I also think there's an old libertarian tradition in the 19th century of defining classical liberalism as opposition to privilege. And the privilege they were talking about was state-granted privilege, right? And the idea that whether it was monopolies, whether it was unions, whether it was the privilege of whites being able to own African Americans, I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which the state treats people unequally and grants some people privilege over others. And I really like that word privilege to be used in that sense. And I'd like to see us try to, as the left would say, queer it, right? Which is to grab it back in a whole bunch of ways, because I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there about what we mean by privilege and about why it can be problematic when it's understood correctly. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Steve. That was another great talk. We have about 15 minutes left for what might otherwise be Q&A, but I think what I'd prefer, if you guys are happy, we will throw it to you guys to have a discussion back and forth. If Stephen Hicks would like to respond to that, and then you guys can just interrupt each other as you see.
Yeah. Well, no, I like Steve's framing this as we do, I think by my count, share about 85 to 90% of agreement.
That's probably right.
And some of this, I think, is a strategic, right, and in some cases tactical issue, and then when to use certain terminologies and when to form alliances, right, and so on. So let me just kind of make one philosophical point. Suppose we are interested in crime, right, as a general category, and we're concerned with fighting crime, and then we take an example of stealing, right? Now, suppose I tell you that somebody stole $1,000 from this guy, and I say, what do you think about that? I think we as libertarians should be very clear about saying, well, that is a violation of property rights. It undercuts all this, that, and the other thing. And the police should, to the extent they have resources, go after people who are thieves. It's a matter of justice and protection of property rights as universal principles. Now, immediately then, we run into those who will say, well, I don't quite know how to answer the question. I need a little bit more information. So then I come forward with some more information. I say, the person who was stolen from the $1,000 is a millionaire versus the person who was stolen from was a poor guy with 4 kids and a wife who needs some medical treatment. Now, what's your reaction? Now, if your reaction is to say, oh, I don't really care about the rich guy, I care about the poor guy. As a matter of demographic fact, the vast majority of people in the social justice movement are not particularly caring about the $1,000 that was stolen from the rich guy, but their hearts do go out and they will be outraged about the $1,000 stolen from the poor guy. Now that, I think, points up an issue that we need to face very squarely, right? If your principles of justice are contingent upon the economic status, in this case of the person, we are dealing with very different people. And we need to, as a matter of clarity, right. Say, no, social justice is not, it doesn't mean that we only care about stealing from poor people and we're going to let the other ones slide. Okay, so that's an issue. Now, at the same time, of course, there is an issue that we might then say, well, if we're in a court of law and we are judges, and the stealing of $1,000 from a poor man, we take into account the consequences of that compared to a stealing $1,000 from a rich guy, the consequences of that. There might be some nuancing to how we treat that. Now, that I think is a philosophical point that we do have to stick to our guns on. We're concerned with justice, not class-based justice. Now, then I think, though, to make a transition to Steve's point, I think I'm fine with saying that as a matter of strategy or tactics, we say, okay, fine, we have the broader libertarian movement, and we fought and won the battle over religious liberty, and then we fought and won the battle over political rights, right, and equality. And now in the 20th century, rather, we've spent a lot of time on the economic liberty issue. So we win. But in each case, what we have is a different strategic focus that we are applying our general principles to. And then we did it with gay rights, and we won that, although, of course, we had some strategic alliances there. And so maybe what Steve is talking about is then to say, what really are the burning issues right now where we need to get the most traction is in cases of racism, police brutality, this, that, and the other thing. So keeping our principles very clear, we're just devoting strategic resources and attention to those issues. I am perfectly fine with that. And again, as long as we are keeping the strategic alliance principles clear. Go ahead.
I think, and so let's play with that for a minute. I think two things. First, to stay with your 1,000 example, right? I agree with you, and it's crucial that we talk in terms of equality before the law. I think sometimes libertarians forget about that principle when we talk about other kinds of things. So yes, but I think the situation that we might find ourselves in today is more like one guy had $1,000 stolen from him, and another guy had $10,000 stolen from him, and we're spending a lot more time worrying about the $1,000 than the $10,000. Now, they're both rights violations, of course, and we want to pay attention to both of them. But we might want to say, which is the bigger rights violation? Or perhaps a better analogy, some guy had $1,000 stolen from him, another guy got his arm chopped off or got stabbed or, whatever. So I think the question is, for me, it's not just a strategic question. I think it is a strategic question, but not just a strategic question. It's where are the most severe rights violations taking place? And when we see the knee on the neck of George Floyd, that's a different thing to me than whether the marginal tax rate is 5% too high, right? And I think so I think it's part of, and I'm glad to, part of that's judgment, but I also think part of it is a kind of broader historical and a larger understanding of what we mean by rights and human rights and freedom and all the ways that libertarians would talk about them. So I think that, watching where the state is really overpowering people and focusing our energy there is not just a matter of strategy, though I think it can be a really effective strategy. I think there's a principle in there too about where the worst rights violations are taking place.
Absolutely right. So then it'd be like to go back to the $1,000 analogy. If it turns out with the crime wave where all the stealing is going on is in the poor neighborhoods that they really are being ravaged. That's right. Then we pay attention to those and we divert more police resources there. But then similarly, if it turns out there's a crime wave that's going on in the rich neighborhoods. Stuff is being destroyed, then the police devote their resources there.
Yeah, and I do. Again, it's hard where that line is between strategy and sort of principle for me. There's both are here, and I think it's. I think the part of the problem is we as libertarians kind of come off just with a sounding like a bad chord when we are spending so much time focused, again, I'll just pick on this, on the marginal tax rate and not talking enough about the George Floyds and the Eric Gardners and all the rest that has incensed so many people. Again, that's not to say that taxation isn't a problem, and so, I'm an economist after all, but really, where our energy should be focused, I think, is and which rights violations matter more are questions we need to ask ourselves. And it's if you've been following Twitter the last 24 hours, when the Libertarian Party presidential nominee says Black Lives Matter and we need to be anti-racist, and suddenly half of libertarian Twitter says, well, I'm out of here, right? Guys, understand, right, that this is a matter of emphasis, and this is a matter of how we need to be in that conversation, and being in that conversation, there's nothing inherent in being in that conversation that's anti or unlibertarian. There are ways to enter that conversation about Black Lives Matter, about anti-racism, that don't require us to give up our principles.
Mm-hmm. Just kicking it back to our moderators. Should we just carry on, or did you want to direct us?
It's all right. unmute myself. You still have another 5 minutes if you want if you have anything else to say. If not, we still have some questions lined up, but we're happy for you guys to go back and forth. Sure. I'm really enjoying seeing that.
Yes.
Yeah, another interesting issue then in Steve's remarks, and they do overlap with my remarks, is this issue of individual, institutional, right, structural, and systemic. And so when you read the literature, so we say there's an injustice, and then in many cases, of course, we're having an academic taxonomy that we're trying to develop. And my view is that Steve was talking about institutional and structural, and that we need to pay attention to that. And I think that is fine, but again, we need to be clear about what that means. So, and I'll just telegraph my conclusion that my reading of these four types, individual injustices, institutional injustices, those two are okay. When you get to systemic and structural, that's where there are, we're dealing with academics and intellectuals who are coming from a very alien tradition, and I think we have to abjure any use, right, of those labels as well. So I think, to take Steve's examples, I'm perfectly fine with saying there are lots of institutions, right, that do bad things, right? So there are businesses that have kind of baked into their culture inappropriate attitudes toward women or racial minorities or religious minorities, right, and so on. Even if the individuals, for the most part, in that organization don't subscribe to those values, there are just policy, not even policies, but in many cases, culture, just practices, culture that has come along. And so, if that's what we mean by institutional dysfunction, then of course that's a legitimate phenomenon. We need to take care of it. But we always have to say that the problem with that injustice is that you are inappropriately treating an individual, right? And here, if it is in fact a policy that's on the books, that's a policy that we need to pay attention. An individual policy someone's put out, and it's being enforced by some individuals. So ultimately, the individual talk does need to be broken down to institutions. Even, I want to say, in the case of something like a legacy law, there's some stupid law on the books that was passed in 1913, right, or something like that, and it's on the books, and it's more or less mechanically by rote, and nobody's kind of half aware that the policy is there. Okay, fine. If that's what you mean by institutional, say, racism or sexism, yes, we flag that. But the problem with it is not social justice. It's that it's an injustice. It violates the rights of individuals.
And one thing I'd add to that, I think oftentimes those sorts of things can be embedded in the culture of an organization or the culture of a society in ways that the people in them don't explicitly recognize. And so we end up treating people differentially in the ways that you're talking about, invisibly. We don't see it, and oftentimes it takes the people who are the victims of that differential treatment to call it to our attention and say, hey, this is, think about how you treated me versus how you treated this other person. It's not explicit, but you do that. And I don't like the word privilege to describe the person who benefits from that, because I think it abuses a word that has a much better use. But the concept underlying it, I think, is valid, which is that some people are, for lack of a better term, are getting a pass, or others are being treated poorly as a result of those cultural norms and those that stuff that's embedded in culture that we don't always see. Right,
it's a concept, and we need to use it for sure.
Yeah, you're right, and so I think that's one of the ways in which when people tell me, use check your privilege or whatever, I try not to hear that word privilege, but I do think they are sometimes, if not oftentimes, saying, hey, there's some inequity happening here that you didn't realize you were engaging in, and I'm calling it to your attention. I think the other problem, of course, is then the question becomes, is it genuinely an inequity? And I think you addressed some of that in your opening remarks, which is sometimes the things that our friends on the left think are injustices are in fact not injustices, right? And secondly, what's the solution if they are injustices, right? We might have really different views on that. But to point out that inequitable treatment in ways that are culturally embedded, that aren't in the law or policy, are real phenomena, right? I think is valid.
It's true. So yeah, I agree with all of that. So just on this issue of institutional, structural, and so on, my reading of the literature here, particularly the intellectual history of this, is that we should be very wary of the uses of structural, right, racism, because that literature entirely has a metaphysics that
yeah, fair enough.
And that there
I'm
are these
fine.
structures, these social structures, and that we're born into them, and they constitute us. And so even if you're not a racist, even if there are no explicit cultural problems or explicit laws, nonetheless, there's this amorphic metaphysical force that only specially trained individual know about.
Right.
That is a suspect concept. So
we have to be careful. I agree. We have to be careful with that one.
Gentlemen, we are just about at the end for this session, but I wanted to throw to you guys for one last sentence or summary or wrap up for what you've been saying today.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Yeah, I would say I don't think it should be an either or. Kind of philosophical clarity and consistency and kind of strategic and tactical effectiveness. So Steve is a very careful academic in his thinking. I strive to be that as well. We have very powerful conceptual tools in our political philosophy and our economic philosophy that have been honed over centuries. Let's use them and stick to them well. And then when we have a philosophical disagreement, make sure that we're not shying away from engaging that philosophical disagreement. At the same time, we should be able to form strategic alliances and allocate our resources, including tactical associations, with people we ordinarily would disagree with in order to get some actual good results done. Right? So let's strive to do both.
Yeah, and I would close by just saying, I think if libertarians don't find a way to have these conversations and come to terms with the issues being raised by the social justice movement, we're simply going to be out of the meaningful conversations in political and social philosophy and in ground politics that are going to take place. And we're going to lose, I think, a generation of young people if we can't find a way to come to terms with it. That doesn't, again, mean we have to sacrifice our principles. It means that we need to think really carefully about how to apply those principles in ways that engage that conversation rather than run away from it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. This, I think, was a great session,
really
both because we had a couple of great talks and also because we didn't have to moderate the Q&A. You guys did that yourself. So that's a win-win. So thank you very much, gentlemen.